The rain was falling so hard that night that the security cameras outside the Cross Tower could barely make out her face. But they caught everything else. A woman in a soaked gray coat, standing at the staff entrance, holding a single folder against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. She had just been turned away by a man who owned 42 buildings across 3 continents. And she said nothing. She simply turned and disappeared into the storm. What that man did not know was that the woman he had just dismissed like she was nothing could have shut down his entire company with a single signature. Buried in a vault 2 floors beneath the building he was standing in, under a trust sealed for 11 years, was a document that named her the owner of 49% of everything he called his. He thought he was hiring a maid. He was about to let the most powerful woman in his life walk out the door twice. This is the story of how a billionaire built an empire on a lie, how a poor woman scrubbing his floors held the truth that could end him, and how one birthday, the day everything was supposed to fall into place, became the day his entire world came apart. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why the people with the least to say are sometimes the ones holding everything. Let's go back to where it all began. Nathaniel Cross was 38 years old, and by every measure that mattered to the world, he had already won. He controlled Cross Meridian Holdings, a company his father built from a single shipping contract into an empire spanning logistics, real estate, and private equity. Nathaniel had grown up watching his father close deals over dinner, watching him treat kindness as a weakness and hesitation as a death sentence. By the time Nathaniel took over the company at 31, he had absorbed every lesson his father taught him, including the one that mattered most in that house: never let anyone get close enough to hurt you. He lived in a glass house on a hill outside the city, 40 rooms, a staff of 12, and not one photograph of another human being on the walls. He had dated women who wanted his name more than they wanted him. He trusted almost no one, and the one person he had trusted completely, his father, had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind a company, a fortune, and a silence Nathaniel had never been able to explain. Because there was something strange about his father's death. Something about the will. A clause that made no sense. A missing 11% of company shares that the lawyers could never quite account for, filed away in paperwork that pointed to a trust nobody could locate. Nathaniel had asked about it once, gotten a vague answer from the family attorney, and let it go. He had a company to run. He didn't have time to chase ghosts. He should have made time. Because the ghost was about to knock on his door in the rain, wearing a second-hand coat. Her name was Adia Bennett, and if you had passed her on the street that year, you would never have guessed the truth. She was 29, working 2 jobs, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with her grandmother, a woman named Corinne who had raised her since she was 7. Adia cleaned offices at night and waited tables during the day. Her grandmother's medical bills had eaten through what little savings they had, and the 2 of them were 3 months behind on rent in a building where the landlord had already started leaving warnings taped to the door. What Adia didn't talk about, what she had never told a single soul outside her grandmother, was where she came from. Corinne had raised her on stories about a man named Adia Bennett, Adia's grandfather, a brilliant engineer who had partnered with a young, hungry businessman decades ago to build a shipping company out of nothing but 2 trucks and a warehouse. That businessman's name was Marcus Cross. Nathaniel's father. According to Corinne, Elias and Marcus had built the first version of what would become Cross Meridian Holdings together, 50-50, shaking hands on a deal with no lawyers in the room because they trusted each other like brothers. But something happened. Something that Corinne would never fully explain, no matter how many times young Adia asked. All she would say was that Elias had been pushed out, quietly, permanently, and that Marcus Cross had gone on to build an empire on the back of a partnership that history had erased completely. Elias died when Adia was 5. Corinne buried the truth with him, telling Adia only fragments over the years, always ending the story the same way. One day, she would say, it will matter again. Just not yet. Adia had stopped believing that a long time ago. She had a grandmother to take care of and rent to pay. She didn't have time for old family fairy tales about a company that belonged to some other world entirely, a world with tower buildings and private jets, a world that would never intersect with hers. She had no idea how wrong she was. It started with an ad. A staffing agency was hiring domestic help for private residences, and the pay was almost double what Adia made cleaning offices. She applied without much hope. 3 days later, she got a call back and an opening at a property outside the city, 5 days a week, housekeeping for a single client. They didn't tell her the client's name. They didn't need to. When she pulled up to the address on interview day and saw the glass house rising out of the hillside, she understood exactly whose door she was standing at. Nathaniel Cross wasn't even supposed to be home that day. His assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Shah, was supposed to run the interviews alone. But Nathaniel had a habit of watching people before trusting them with access to his home, so he stood in the kitchen with a coffee and observed the candidates from a distance, the way he'd watch a boardroom before deciding who to trust. Adia was the 4th interview of the day. She walked in wearing a blazer that didn't quite fit, borrowed from a friend for the occasion, and answered every question with a steadiness that surprised Priya. No excuses about her situation, no desperation in her voice, just clear, direct answers. When Priya asked why she wanted the position, Adia said something simple. Because I take care of things. That's what I've always done. From the kitchen doorway, Nathaniel watched her say it, and something about the way she held herself, calm, unshaken, like she had faced far bigger rooms than this one, made him pause his coffee halfway to his mouth. He didn't know why. He brushed it off as nothing. He had no idea he was looking at the granddaughter of the man his father had erased from history. Adia got the job. She started the following Monday, and for the first few weeks, her life at the Cross estate was exactly what you'd expect. Long hours, a demanding schedule, and a boss who barely acknowledged her existence. Nathaniel Cross did not make small talk with staff. He walked past Adia in the hallways without a glance. He left instructions through Priya rather than speaking to her directly. To him, she was furniture with a pulse, one more moving part in a household designed to run without friction, without noise, without anything that required his attention. But small things started happening. Things that didn't add up. One afternoon, Nathaniel came home early from a meeting and found Adia in his study, dusting the shelves. On the desk sat a framed photograph of his father shaking hands with a man Nathaniel didn't recognize, an old black and white print from decades ago that had somehow survived every renovation of the house. Adia had stopped mid-motion, staring at it. Nathaniel noticed the way her hand trembled slightly as she set it back down, the way her jaw tightened for just a second before she resumed her work like nothing happened. He almost asked her about it. Almost. But he didn't. He had a call to make and a merger to finalize, and whatever flicker of curiosity he felt got buried under the next item on his schedule. He told himself it didn't matter. It mattered more than he could possibly imagine. Because the man in that photograph was Adia Bennett, Adia's grandfather. And the smile on his face in that old picture was the same smile Adia had seen in the one surviving photo her grandmother kept in a drawer at home, worn soft at the edges from being held too many times. That night, Adia went home and told her grandmother what she'd seen. Corinne, now 81 and increasingly frail, sat very still for a long moment before she spoke. "You're in that house," she said quietly. "After all this time." "Grandma, what does that mean?" Corinne reached for a small metal box she kept locked in her closet, one Adia had seen 100 times but had never been allowed to open. Inside was a stack of old documents, yellowed at the edges, along with a key that Adia had never seen before. Corinne held the box in her lap like it weighed 100 pounds. "Your grandfather didn't just work for Marcus Cross," she said. "He built that company with him. Half of it was his. And when Marcus decided he didn't want to share what they'd built, he pushed Elias out, so quietly that by the time your grandfather understood what happened, there was nothing left to fight for. No lawyer back then would touch a case against a man with that kind of money. Elias signed papers he didn't fully understand, believing Marcus's promise that it was temporary. It never was." Adia felt her stomach turn. "Then why didn't you ever do anything? Why didn't you fight it?" "Because your grandfather did one thing before he signed those papers," Corinne said. "He didn't trust Marcus Cross completely, even as a young man. So he kept a separate document. A private trust, drawn up by a lawyer who wasn't connected to either of them, naming his direct descendants as beneficiaries of a percentage of future company holdings, tied to specific conditions. It was legal. It was real. But it required something we never had at Adia. Money. Lawyers. A way to prove it in front of people who would rather believe a rich man than a poor family with an old piece of paper. She opened the box and placed the documents in Adia's hands. "I always told you it would matter one day," Corinne whispered. "I think that day just found you." Adia stared at the paperwork until the words blurred. A trust. Her grandfather's name. A percentage, the number blacked out by time and folding, but still legible if you looked closely enough. 49%. She sat on the floor of that small apartment for hours that night, holding papers that could change everything, and feeling more afraid than she had ever felt in her life. Because she understood something immediately that would define everything that happened next. If this was real, the man she worked for, the man who walked past her in his own hallway without a second glance, was sitting on top of an empire that was half hers. And if the wrong people found out before she did anything about it, the truth could disappear as easily as her grandfather's ownership had disappeared 30 years earlier. She had no idea, at that moment, just how many people were already circling that exact secret. There was a man inside Cross Meridian Holdings named Victor Aldrich, the company's chief financial officer, who had worked alongside Marcus Cross for over 20 years and had been quietly furious ever since Nathaniel took over the company instead of him. He had helped Marcus Cross bury the original partnership dispute decades earlier, back when he was a junior accountant hungry to prove his loyalty. He knew about the missing 11% in the filings. He had spent years quietly trying to locate any trace of a Bennett heir, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Because if that trust ever surfaced, it wouldn't just cost Nathaniel a piece of the company. It would expose exactly how the company had been built. And Victor had signed off on paperwork decades ago that made him just as guilty as Marcus Cross ever was. Victor had been searching for any living Bennett relative for years, using resources Nathaniel didn't even know existed within the legal division, always one step behind. He didn't know the woman he was hunting had just been hired to dust the shelves in the house he still visited every week. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Adia made a decision that would define the next several weeks of her life. She decided to say nothing. Not yet. She needed proof beyond an old trust document that a court could actually verify. She needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with before she brought this to a man who had every resource in the world to bury her the same way his father had buried her grandfather. So she kept working. She kept her head down. And she started watching. She noticed things now that she hadn't paid attention to before. The way Nathaniel ran his household like a fortress, cameras in every hallway, staff signing confidentiality agreements before their first shift. The way Priya Shah handled every scrap of paperwork entering or leaving the house. The way Victor Aldrich visited the estate twice that month, always tense, always leaving Nathaniel's study looking like he'd aged 5 years. And she noticed Nathaniel himself. Not the version of him the tabloids wrote about, the cold, ruthless dealmaker who had reportedly ended 3 engagements before they reached the altar. The real version. The man who worked until 2 in the morning most nights and ate dinner alone at a table built for 12. The man who, once, when he thought no one was watching, stood in front of his father's old office door for almost a full minute before turning away without going inside. She started to understand something uncomfortable. Nathaniel Cross wasn't just the villain in her grandmother's story. He was also a man carrying something heavy that he had never once put down. It didn't change what she needed to do. But it complicated things in a way she hadn't expected. The first real crack in Nathaniel's indifference came 4 weeks into Adia's employment, on a night that started like any other and ended with him seeing her for the first time. He had come home from a dinner that went badly. An investor had backed out of a deal at the last minute, costing the company nearly $60 million, and he was in the kind of mood that sent everyone else scattering to their rooms. He walked into the kitchen expecting silence and found Adia there instead, sitting at the small staff table, her grandmother's medical bills spread in front of her, a calculator and a look of quiet, controlled panic on her face. She hadn't heard him come in. For a moment, he just watched her, the same way he had that first day in the interview, except this time there was no interview happening, no performance, just a woman doing math on numbers that clearly weren't in her favor, her lips moving slightly as she recalculated something for what looked like the fifth time. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She startled, quickly gathering the papers, embarrassed. "No, sir. I'm sorry, I'll clear this up." "That's not what I asked." She hesitated, unsure whether answering honestly would cost her the job. But something in his voice, not softness exactly, but a kind of directness that demanded the same in return, made her tell him a small piece of the truth. "My grandmother's in the hospital. Has been for a few days. I'm trying to figure out how to cover it without falling further behind on everything else." Nathaniel didn't say anything for a long moment. He had heard 100 sob stories in his life, most of them designed to extract sympathy or money or both. He had built a wall against exactly this kind of moment years ago. But something about the way she said it, not asking for anything, just stating a fact and moving on with her life, cut straight through that wall before he even realized it was happening. "Which hospital?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Adia blinked at him, confused. "Why?" "Because I'm asking," she told him. He said nothing else that night. But the next morning, Priya Shah informed Adia, with visible confusion on her own face, that Mr. Cross had authorized full coverage of her grandmother's remaining medical expenses, quietly, through a private account, with no explanation given and no expectation of repayment. Adia sat in her car in the estate's driveway for 20 minutes that morning before she could bring herself to go inside. Because the man she had spent weeks preparing to confront, the man whose family had erased hers from history, had just done something no one had done for her in years. He had helped without being asked twice, without wanting credit, without a single word about it afterward. It didn't erase what his father had done. It didn't change what she still needed to do. But it planted a question in her mind that would grow louder over the following weeks. What if the man in front of her had nothing to do with the sins of the man before him? She didn't get long to sit with that question, because the world around her was moving faster than she realized. Victor Aldrich had finally caught a break in his search. A junior associate in the legal department, digging through old archived filings as part of a routine audit, had stumbled across a decades-old reference to the Bennett Trust buried in a footnote of a document nobody had opened in over 15 years. Victor requested the file personally, citing due diligence for an upcoming shareholder meeting, and when it landed on his desk, his hands actually shook as he read it. The trust was real. It was still active. And according to the original terms, it would fully vest, meaning the beneficiary could legally claim their percentage of company shares on the beneficiary's 30th birthday, provided they could prove direct lineage to Elias Bennett. Victor did the math immediately. Elias Bennett's only child had died years ago. That left one living descendant unaccounted for, based on the last records anyone had on file. A granddaughter. Born the same year as a birth certificate buried in an old employee file from decades earlier, back when Elias's daughter had briefly worked administrative jobs within the company before cutting ties completely. Victor didn't know her name yet. But he knew she existed, and he knew her 30th birthday was closer than anyone realized. If that trust vested without anyone at Cross Meridian Holdings controlling the narrative first, it wouldn't just cost Nathaniel nearly half his company. It would trigger a mandatory legal review of exactly how the original ownership dispute had been handled 30 years earlier. And Victor Aldrich had signed the very documents that made that dispute look clean on paper when it hadn't been clean at all. He had two choices. Find the granddaughter and make her disappear from the paper trail before the vesting date, burying the trust so deep it would never surface again. Or find her and make sure Nathaniel never learned the full truth of what she was entitled to, positioning himself as the one who handled the problem quietly, the way he'd handled it for Marcus Cross decades before. Either way, he needed to find her first. And he had no idea she was cleaning the floors of the very house he kept visiting. The tension in the story sharpened from here, because two people were now circling the same secret from opposite directions, and neither of them knew how close the other one was. Adia, for her part, had started gathering everything she needed. She found a lawyer, a young attorney named Marcus Whitfield, no relation to anyone in this story, who worked mostly pro bono cases and agreed to review her grandmother's documents after Adia explained the situation in careful, guarded terms. Whitfield confirmed what Corinne had told her. The trust appeared legitimate. The language was airtight. And the vesting clause tied to Adia's 30th birthday meant she had less than 6 weeks before the countdown her grandmother had warned her about her entire life would finally run out, one way or another. Whitfield gave her one crucial piece of advice. The moment you make this public, or the moment the company becomes aware you exist, you lose control of the timeline. They will have lawyers, resources, and 30 years of practice protecting this exact secret. You need to be the one who decides when this comes out, not them. Adia understood exactly what that meant. She needed to keep working in that house, keep her head down, and find a way to protect herself and the truth until she was ready, all while living under the same roof as the very company trying to erase her existence before she could claim it. It was during this stretch of weeks that something else started happening, something Adia hadn't planned for and couldn't fully explain even to herself. She and Nathaniel started talking. Not often. Not in long conversations. But small moments accumulated the way they do between two people circling something neither wants to name. He started coming down to the kitchen more, not because he needed anything, but because, if he was honest with himself, he had started looking forward to the 10 minutes a night when Adia would talk to him like he was a person instead of a name on a building. She never asked him for anything. She never flattered him. Once, when he made an offhand comment about a business decision, she disagreed with him so plainly and so correctly that he sat in silence for a full minute afterward, genuinely unsettled by how right she was. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked her one night, only half joking. "You'd be surprised what you learn scrubbing floors in rich people's houses," she said. "You hear a lot. You notice more." He laughed, actually laughed, a sound Priya later told Adia she hadn't heard from him in over a year. But every one of these moments came with a weight Adia carried alone. Because every laugh, every small kindness, every night he lingered in that kitchen a little longer than necessary, made what she knew she eventually had to do feel heavier. She wasn't just planning to confront a company anymore. She was planning to blow apart the life of a man who had started, against every instinct she had built to protect herself, to feel less like an enemy and more like someone she didn't want to hurt. And then, 3 weeks before Adia's 30th birthday, Victor Aldrich found her. It happened almost by accident. Victor had requested personnel files for every member of Nathaniel's household staff, using his position to frame it as a routine security review ahead of an upcoming board meeting. When Adia's file crossed his desk, her full name, her date of birth, and, buried in the background check, her grandmother's name listed as next of kin, Victor felt something close to vertigo. Corinne Bennett. He stared at that name for almost a full minute before the room seemed to tilt around him. The granddaughter he had been hunting for weeks wasn't hiding somewhere across the country. She was standing in Nathaniel Cross's kitchen every single night, dusting his shelves, cleaning his floors, sitting 15 feet from the man whose empire she could legally dismantle in 3 weeks. Victor didn't go to Nathaniel. That was the first sign of exactly how far he was willing to go to protect himself. Instead, he requested a private meeting with Adia directly, using a pretense about updated tax paperwork for household staff, and had her brought to a small conference room on the estate's lower level, away from cameras, away from Priya, away from Nathaniel. Adia walked in expecting a routine HR conversation. She realized within seconds that it was anything but. "I know who you are," Victor said, closing the door behind her. "I know what your grandfather signed. I know what happens to this company if that trust vests in 3 weeks." Adia felt the floor drop out from under her, but she kept her face perfectly still, a skill she'd spent her entire life building in rooms far less powerful than this one. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," Victor said, his voice sharpening. "I've spent 30 years protecting this company from exactly this conversation. I'm not going to pretend with you, and I'd advise you not to pretend with me. Here's what I'm offering. A settlement. Enough money to take care of your grandmother, enough to disappear somewhere comfortable, in exchange for you signing away any claim to that trust, quietly, before your birthday. No lawyers. No court. No mess. And if I say no? Victor's expression didn't change, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. Then I make sure the vesting never happens at all. There are ways to make paperwork disappear. There are ways to make people disappear from paperwork. I've done it before. Your grandfather is proof of that. The threat sat in the room like something physical. Adia felt her hands go cold, felt every instinct in her body screaming to get out of that room, but she held her ground, because she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what kind of man was standing in front of her. You're afraid, she said quietly. This isn't about protecting the company. This is about protecting you. Because if that trust surfaces, everyone finds out you helped bury a man's entire life's work 30 years ago. That's what you're scared of. Not the money. The truth. Victor's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to confirm she was right. You have until the end of the week, he said. Consider the offer. Or consider what happens if you don't. Adia walked out of that room shaking, but she didn't cry, and she didn't run. She went straight to her car, called Marcus Whitfield, and told him everything. Whitfield's response was immediate and firm. Do not sign anything. Do not meet with him alone again. And Adia, you need to tell Nathaniel Cross the truth, now, before Victor Aldrich decides to solve this problem a different way. That night was the hardest of Adia's life. She sat in her apartment, her grandmother finally home from the hospital and asleep in the next room, and stared at the small metal box that had started all of this, weighing a decision that would either save everything she'd worked for or destroy the one relationship in that glass house that had started to feel, however impossibly, like it mattered. She decided to tell him. Not because Whitfield told her to. Because she realized, sitting there in the quiet of her apartment, that she didn't want Nathaniel Cross to find out the truth from someone like Victor Aldrich, twisted into whatever version served Victor's interests. If this was going to end everything between them, she at least wanted him to hear it from her, honestly, completely, before it was too late. She went to the estate the next morning and asked Priya for 5 minutes with Nathaniel. Priya, sensing something serious in Adia's face, cleared his schedule without asking questions. Nathaniel was standing at the window of his study when Adia walked in, the same study where she'd first seen that photograph weeks earlier. He turned, and whatever he saw in her expression made his easy half-smile disappear instantly. What's wrong, he said. Adia set the metal box on his desk. Her hands were steady even though her heart wasn't. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if I stop, I don't think I'll be able to start again. Over the next 20 minutes, Adia told him everything. Her grandfather. The original partnership. The trust. The vesting date 3 weeks away. Victor Aldrich's threat the day before. She watched Nathaniel's face move through disbelief, then something closer to devastation, as 30 years of half-answers about a missing 11% in his father's old filings finally clicked into a shape he had never let himself imagine. When she finished, the study was silent for a long time. Say something, Adia finally said. Nathaniel sat down slowly, like the weight of it had physically hit him. My father told me that missing percentage was a clerical error from an old restructuring. I asked him about it once, years ago. He looked me in the eye and lied to me. I'm sorry, Adia said, and meant it, even though some small, exhausted part of her had expected anger instead of this quiet, wrecked stillness. You're sorry, he repeated, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it. You've been carrying this since before you walked through my door for that interview. You've been cleaning my house, having dinner conversations with me, while sitting on the one truth that could take everything I have. And you're sorry. I didn't come here to take anything from you, Adia said, her voice sharper now, some old defensive instinct rising despite herself. I came here because a man who works for your company threatened to make me and my grandfather's entire existence disappear on paper if I didn't sign away what's legally mine. I came here because I would rather you hear the truth from me than from him. Nathaniel looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not fury. Fear. Victor threatened you, he said slowly. Yes. Directly. Yes. Nathaniel stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. Whatever personal reckoning he'd been having about his father, his company, and the woman standing in front of him got shoved aside instantly by something more immediate, more protective, an instinct he didn't examine too closely in the moment. He doesn't get to threaten someone in my house. He doesn't get to threaten you. It should have felt like a small thing. But to Adia, after weeks of bracing for him to see her as a threat, hearing him call Victor's behavior unacceptable before he'd even fully processed what it meant for his own company hit her harder than she expected. "There's more," Adia said. "He said there are ways to make the vesting never happen. Ways to make people disappear from paperwork. He's done it before." Nathaniel's face went pale. "My father's old accountant. He's been with this company since before I was born. He helped bury my grandfather's ownership 30 years ago," Adia said quietly. "I think he's terrified of what happens to him if the truth comes out now." Nathaniel stood at the window for a long moment, his back to her, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, stripped of the cool control she'd grown used to. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I don't care about the 49%. I care that a man in my company threatened a woman in my house, using the exact same tactics my father apparently used against her family 30 years ago. That's not a business problem to me right now. That's personal. It's 49% of a multi-billion-dollar company," Adia said carefully. "You should care." He turned to face her. "I will. Tomorrow. Today, I care about the fact that Victor Aldrich thinks he can threaten someone under my roof and get away with it." There was a beat of silence between them, heavier than anything that had passed between them before. "Why does this matter to you?" Adia asked quietly. "Really?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was low. "Because in 4 weeks of you working in this house, you've been more honest with me than almost anyone in my life has been in years. And I'd rather lose half my company to someone honest than keep it because a man like Victor made sure the truth never surfaced." It wasn't a declaration of anything. It wasn't a promise. But it was enough to make Adia realize that whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. They had 3 weeks before the vesting date, and a man inside the company who was now dangerous enough to move against both of them if he felt cornered. The next stretch of the story moved fast, each day adding new stakes, new pressure, new reasons the walls felt like they were closing in. Nathaniel brought in his own legal team the next morning, separate from the company's internal counsel, people he trusted personally rather than people who answered to the board. He had them verify the trust independently, and within 4 days, they confirmed exactly what Marcus Whitfield had already found. The document was legitimate. Airtight. Impossible to challenge on legal grounds. Which meant Victor's only remaining option, if he wanted to stop the vesting, was to make sure it never reached that point at all. Victor, sensing the walls closing in around him, made his move faster than either Nathaniel or Adia expected. He went to the board. Not with the truth, Victor would never hand over the truth voluntarily, but with a carefully constructed version of it, framing Adia as a con artist who had infiltrated Nathaniel's household staff specifically to manipulate him into believing a fabricated claim on the company, timed suspiciously close to a board vote on a major acquisition Nathaniel had been pushing for months. Victor painted Nathaniel as compromised, emotionally manipulated by a woman clever enough to insert herself into his personal life before making her move. It was a lie built cleverly around a truth, which made it dangerous, because half of what he said about the timeline and the trust document itself was real. An emergency board session was called for the following week, 3 days before Adia's 30th birthday. Nathaniel would need to defend both the legitimacy of the trust and his own judgment in front of a room of people who controlled enough combined voting shares to make his life extremely difficult if they turned against him. The days leading up to that meeting were some of the tensest of the entire ordeal. Adia barely slept. Her grandmother, sensing the storm gathering around her granddaughter, tried to comfort her the way she had when Adia was a little girl, though even Corinne couldn't hide her own fear about what was coming. "Your grandfather waited his whole life for someone to believe him," Corinne said one night, holding Adia's hand. "Don't let them make you disappear the way they made him disappear." Nathaniel, for his part, spent those days in a kind of controlled fury Priya had never seen from him, working with his personal legal team late into the night, building a case not just for the trust's legitimacy, but against Victor Aldrich directly. During that process, something surfaced that changed everything again. One of Nathaniel's lawyers, digging through decades-old financial records, found something Victor had clearly believed was buried forever. A wire transfer from 30 years earlier, authorized by Marcus Cross and processed personally by Victor Aldrich, paid to the same attorney who had drawn up the papers Adia Bennett signed the day he was pushed out. A payment that had nothing to do with legal fees and everything to do with making sure Elias never fully understood what he was signing away. It was the proof Whitfield needed to show, beyond any doubt, that the original ownership transfer hadn't just been unfair. It had been engineered. Deliberately. With Victor Aldrich's direct involvement. When Nathaniel saw that wire transfer, something in him went quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with his usual boardroom composure. He sat with it for a long time before calling Adia. "I found it," he said simply. "Everything your grandmother told you. It's real. My father didn't just take advantage of a technicality. He and Victor built the whole thing to make sure Elias never had a chance to fight back." Adia was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "I know he was your father." "Don't be sorry," Nathaniel said. "Be ready. Because in 3 days, I'm going to stand in front of that board and tell them exactly what my father and Victor Aldrich did, and exactly why you deserve every percentage point that trust entitles you to." "They might not believe you," Adia said. "Victor's been there 20 years longer than you have. He has relationships on that board you don't." "Then we make sure they can't afford not to believe us," Nathaniel said. The night before the board meeting became the emotional turning point of the entire story, though neither of them saw it coming until it was already happening. Adia came to the estate late, ostensibly to review final details with the legal team, but the meeting ran short, and the two of them ended up alone in the kitchen again, the same kitchen where all of this had quietly started. Neither said much at first. The weight of the next morning sat heavy between them. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel finally said. "If none of this had happened, if you'd never found that trust, if Victor never threatened you, if I never found that photograph, would you have told me? Any of it?" Adia thought about it honestly before answering. "I don't know. Part of me wanted to hate you before I even met you. My grandmother spent my whole life telling me what your family took from mine. It was easier to believe you'd be exactly like him. And now I know you're not," she said quietly. "That doesn't erase what happened. But it means something, that you didn't have to fight for me the way you have this past week. You could have taken Victor's version of events. It would have been easier." "Easier isn't the same as right," Nathaniel said. "My father taught me a lot of things I'm not proud of. But somewhere in there, buried under all of it, he also used to say that a man's worth isn't what he builds. It's what he's willing to give back when he realizes he took more than his share. I don't think he ever lived by that. I'd like to." The moment stretched between them, quiet, honest, neither of them reaching for anything more than that shared understanding, because both of them knew tomorrow would decide more than either of them could fully control. "Whatever happens in there," Adia said. "Thank you. For believing me before you even fully understood what it would cost you." "Whatever happens in there," Nathaniel said, "you were never someone I was afraid of losing money to. You were someone I was afraid of losing, period." Neither of them said anything else that night. They didn't need to. Some understandings don't need to be spoken to be real. The board meeting the next morning was, by every account from everyone in that room, one of the most extraordinary sessions in the company's history. Victor Aldrich arrived early, composed, ready to present his version of events to a room full of allies he'd spent decades cultivating. He painted Adia as an opportunist, questioned the timing of the trust's discovery, and suggested Nathaniel's judgment had been compromised by a household employee positioned suspiciously close to a 9-figure claim on company shares. For a moment, watching the room nod along, Victor believed he had won. Then Nathaniel stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out the trust document, verified independently by 3 separate legal teams. He laid out the original partnership agreement between Marcus Cross and Adia Bennett, buried for 30 years. And then he laid out the wire transfer, the one connecting Victor Aldrich directly to the manipulation of the original documents Adia Bennett had signed away his ownership under. The room went silent in a way boardrooms rarely do. "My father built part of this company on a lie," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite everything it cost him to say it. "And Victor Aldrich helped him bury that lie for 30 years, then tried to threaten the woman entitled to the truth into silence when it finally resurfaced. I'm not standing here today asking you to believe me because it's convenient. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, because the evidence doesn't care whose son I am or how long Victor has sat in that chair." Victor tried to object, tried to discredit the documents, tried to pivot back to questioning Adia's credibility. But the wire transfer with his own authorization on it made every word out of his mouth sound exactly like what it was. A man trying to save himself. By the time the vote came, it wasn't close. The board recognized the trust as legitimate. Victor Aldrich was removed from his position that same afternoon, and within weeks, formal legal proceedings began examining his role in the original fraud, proceedings that would end his career entirely. 3 days later, on Adia's 30th birthday, the trust officially vested. Adia Bennett became the legal owner of 49% of Cross Meridian Holdings, a company she had been quietly cleaning the floors of only weeks earlier. The story could have ended there, with a courtroom victory and a stunning reversal of fortune, and honestly, that alone would have been enough. But the real ending, the one that mattered most to everyone who lived through it, happened somewhere much quieter than a boardroom. Adia moved her grandmother into a small, comfortable home not far from the city, the first place Corinne had ever owned outright in her life. She didn't buy herself a mansion. Instead, she took her seat on the board of Cross Meridian Holdings and pushed for changes that reflected the values she'd carried through every hard year of her life: fair wages for staff, transparency in contracts, protections for the kind of workers who had once been her, invisible, overworked, and easy to erase from paperwork if the wrong person decided they were inconvenient. Nathaniel didn't fight her on any of it. If anything, he pushed harder than she expected, using the platform he'd inherited to finally correct the parts of his father's legacy he could still reach. Their relationship after that never became some tidy, simple thing. It couldn't. Too much history stood between the Cross name and the Bennett name for it to ever be uncomplicated. But something real had been built in those weeks when neither of them knew what the other one was truly carrying, and that foundation held even after the truth came fully into the light. A year later, at the company's annual shareholder meeting, Nathaniel stood up to give the opening address, something he'd done every year of his leadership. But this time he wasn't standing alone. Adia stood beside him, co-owner in every sense that mattered, not because a court forced the arrangement, but because both of them had chosen to build something honest out of what had once been buried in lies. 30 years ago, Nathaniel told the room, this company was built on a promise between two men. One of them broke that promise, and for 3 decades, we all lived inside the silence that broke created. Today, we're not just correcting a legal record. We're honoring the promise that should have been kept from the beginning. Somewhere in that room sat Corinne Bennett, 82 years old, watching her granddaughter stand in a place her husband had been erased from decades earlier, finally seeing the story she'd carried her whole life reach the ending she'd always believed, against all odds, it deserved. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The people easiest to overlook are sometimes carrying the heaviest truths. The maid scrubbing your floors, the quiet person in the corner who never raises their voice, you rarely know what they're holding until it finally comes out. Adia Bennett didn't need Nathaniel Cross's money. She needed the truth to finally be seen. And in the end, what she got back wasn't just an inheritance. It was the ending her grandfather waited 30 years, and never lived to see, but always believed, somehow, was still coming. If this story moved you, remember it the next time you're quick to judge someone by the job they're doing instead of the story they're carrying. You never really know whose empire you might be standing inside.